He claimed he was told within hours of the shooting to keep quiet, that people bigger than the game had stepped in. Hewell didn't name them, not yet. But the way he said it, calm, confident, careful, you could feel the weight behind it. Like someone who knew the real danger wasn't in what happened that night, but in what followed. And then there was the cremation. Allegedly carried out just one day after Tupac's death by a mortician no one in Las Vegas had ever worked with before. Paid in cash. No invoice, no verification, no ashes given to the family. Just a quick, clean ending to a story that was never supposed to be questioned, but the cracks started showing fast. Reporters tried to trace the crematory, found nothing. 4 requests for hospital documents came back with no record. Even Tupac's own mother, Afeni Shakur, remained vague, at times grief-stricken, at others strangely composed. She spoke more Abuthis. Message than his death? And Suge, he doubled down. Years later, in an offhanded interview, he laughed while saying, "Nobody ever saw a body." You tell me what that means, but what really broke the silence was a sealed affidavit buried in court records from the late 90s that listed Suge Knight as having no knowledge of a deceased estate related to Mr. Shakur. No knowledge of a deceased estate, which means legally Suge never recognized Tupac as dead. And that's not just suspicious, that's intentional. Because if Tupac had faked his death, if he'd orchestrated the shooting and the escape, then he'd need more than silence. He'd need people willing to lie under oath. People willing to never ask questions. People willing to bury a legend without ever burying a body. And Suge Knight, he was the perfect man for that job. Feared, loyal, untouchable in his time. And now, with the industry eating itself from Tyneside, he's finally beginning to speak. Not all at once, not loud, but piece by piece like a man unburdening. A secret so heavy it's bent his entire life. And if what he's saying is true, then we haven't been living with Tupac's death. We've been living with his masterpiece. It was supposed to be a routine check, a prison staffer reviewing call logs for security compliance. But what they found sent shock waves through the administration. Buried in a folder-labeled low-priority non-escalation was a 7-minute recorded phone call between Suge Knight and someone listed only as private line unverified contact. At first, the conversation seemed innocent. A few laughs, some coded slang, but 2 minutes in, Suge's tone shifted. "They think they buried it," he said, "but we just went quiet." Then came the phrase that triggered everything. "We played or parts. Now it's time they know he's still walking." The call was immediately flagged. Within hours, it was deleted from the system. But one guard, a former hip-hop head who recognized the weight of Suge's words, copied the audio before it vanished. That recording found its way online briefly before being scrubbed from every major platform, but not before thousands heard it. The internet lit up, tagged Tupac Eyes, alive trended globally. YouTubers, podcasters, and fans dissected every second of the clip, trying to decode what Shu meant. Was he confirming the long-standing rumors? Was he just playing mind games? Or was this the first real piece of evidence in decades? But then came another twist. The prison issued a statement denying the call even happened. They claimed no sick recording existed, that Suge Knight hadn't spoken to anyone outside of legal counsel in over 2 weeks. Except he had. The call log was real, the timestamp was real, the audio was real, which means the denial. That was the cover. Up. One former death row employee who worked security for Suge back in the early 2000s came forward anonymously. Suge has always been a pressure point. If he talks, everything unravels. That call, that wasn't a slip. That was a warning shot. And that warning didn't just shake fans, it shook suits. Because suddenly files that had been dormant for years were being quietly accessed by federal accounts. Witnesses were recounted. Even old Vegas detectives, now retired, were asked to review inconsistencies in their original reports. Something had changed. Suge had opened a door. Just a crack, but enough to let light in. And maybe the most telling thing wasn't the content of the call. It was Suge's tone. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't reckless. He sounded ready. Like a man who kept a truth buried long enough and decided if he was going to rot in a cell, then the story that put him there wasn't going to rot with him. And the phrase that echoed loudest, "He's still walking," 7 syllables that could blow open one of the greatest mysteries in music history, because if Suge Knight really meant what he said, then Tupac Shakur never died, he disappeared and the world bought the lie. To understand how Tupac could have pulled off the greatest vanishing act in music history, you have to go back before the gunshots, before Vegas, before the beefs and the headlines. You have to go back to Makaveli, because that wasn't just a stage name. It was the blueprint. Tupac's final album before his death wasn't just a collection of tracks. It was a manifesto titled The Dawn Illuminated, The 7-Day Theory. It dropped posthumously, but every detail was carefully designed by Tupac before he vanished. And that title, that wasn't just art, it was a message hidden in plain sight. Tupac had been obsessively studying Niccolo Makaveli, the 15th century political philosopher, who famously wrote about faking one's death to outmaneuver enemies. Pac read his work religiously while locked up in Clinton Correctional Facility. He even told multiple visitors that Makaveli's ideas were more real than the Bible. He wasn't inspired by it. He was preparing. Then the Makaveli album opens with distorted screams, gunshots, sirens. It sounds like chaos, but when you listen closely, it's a funeral, a staged death, a sonic ritual. And in the first track, he says, "Expect me like you expect Jesus to come back." That wasn't just bravado. It was a warning, a prophecy. But Suge says the key to understanding Pac's plan lies in how he used that alter ego. Makaveli was his way out. He told a close source. Pac knew once he became Makaveli, he could disappear and people would just think it was part of the show. And that's exactly what happened. Makaveli dropped, Tupac died. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. A curtain drop. 1 minute he's a living legend. The next he's a ghost and Makaveli becomes immortal. But Suge drops another bomb. That wasn't just music, that album had codes. He claims Pac embedded clues in the lyrics, in the artwork, even in the release date. September 13th, 1996, exactly 7 days after the shooting. Just like the 7-Day Theory, that number shows up everywhere, in the recording schedule and the track list, even in the numeric sequencing of PA's last known movements. It was a countdown, not to death, but toward birth. One prison source even said Suge kept a worn copy of the album tucked inside his legal binder for years. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was instructional. Suge allegedly told a cellmate once the album is the key. Most people think Pac was making music, but he was making an exit. So what does that mean? It means Tupac wasn't trying to survive the game, he was trying to escape it. To step away before they could take him out for real. To burn down the identity they knew and rise again in the shadows. Makaveli wasn't a mask. It was the only version of Tupac that could walk away without being hunted. And now, nearly 30 years later, Suge Knight, arguably the last man alive who knows the full truth, letting the world know. Makaveli didn't die in Vegas. He walked out of history exactly how he planned. It happened during a routine courtroom session, sealed from public access, buried deep within the state's confidential records. Suge Knight was brought in for what was supposed to be a parole progress review, but what unfolded stunned even the few allowed inside. Suge had barely spoken during most of the proceeding. That washes pattern lately, silent, cold, unreadable. But when one of the board members casually mentioned Tupac Shakur in relation to Suge's legacy, something in him changed. He sat forward, his expression tightened, and for the first time in hours, he broke the silence. Ask the man in Nassau. He said. Decode fell dead quiet. At first, no one reacted because no one understood. The judge looked up, confused. The clerk paused her typing. Even the stadium observer tilted his head. It sounded like nonsense, like a strange outburst from a man who'd lost track of reality, but it wasn't nonsense. It was the most dangerous sentence Suge Knight had ever spoken, because Nassau isn't just a city, it's the capital of the Bahamas, an island nation known for its quiet beaches, light-touch law enforcement, and almost no extradition to the U.S. without long drawn-out proceedings. It's also where multiple sightings of Tupac Shakur have been reported over the past 20 years. Always by locals, never tourists. A man matching Pac's build and face. Always wearing a hat. Always vanishing before anyone could get a photo. But here was Suge Knight in the sealed courtroom, deliberately dropping a location. Not a metaphor, not a riddle, a name. And that's why the session ended early. Court staff were ordered out. The audio record was cut. And for the next 48 hours, federal personnel was seen entering and exiting the prison, a place they hadn't visited in nearly a year. The prison visitation room was cold, sterile, and quiet, except for the slow ticking of the wall clock. A producer, cleared for a one-time private meeting, sat across from Suge Knight. Cameras weren't allowed. Phones confiscated, only eyes, ears, and a guarded glass wall separating two lives. Suge leaned forward, his massive frame still intimidating even after all these years been bars. He hadn't spoken much in court, barely said a word to the press in over a decade, but today was different. Today, something inside him was cracking. The producer asked what everyone has been asking for nearly 30 years. Was Tupac really killed that night in Vegas? Suge's face didn't twitch. He stared straight ahead, then let out a low chuckle. Man, what y'all think? The silence that followed felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Suge then said something Thegard on duty couldn't shake for weeks afterward. He ain't dead. He just stepped off the board. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now let's get back to it. That phrase wasn't random. In chess, stepping off the board means voluntary removal. A planned retreat, a disappearance with purpose, not a defeat, an escape. The producer pushed harder, asking what happened in the car that night. The infamous BM, the ambush, the lights, the bullets. Suge paused again, slower this time. They missed on purpose. The phrase hit like a punch to the gut. Everyone had assumed it was a real hit, a retaliation, a war zone attack. But Suge's version unraveled the entire narrative. He explained how the shooters didn't aim for vital spots. The way the glass shattered, the angle of the fire, it didn't match what Hitman would have it on. It was enough to scare the world. Enough to doubt Pierre, Suge said. Then came the bombshell. The last time I saw Pac, he looked right at me and said, "It's time." The producer didn't know what to say. There was no paperwork, no footage from the hospital, no death certificate that ever truly made sense. The cremation was rushed, handled by a man paid in cash who vanished shortly after. No public service, no autopsy photos released, just a sudden closed door. And Suge, he never attended a funeral because according to him, there was nothing to bury. He sat back, smirked for the first time, and whispered, "Pac knew how to disappear." Everyone thought Makaveli was just Nah, it was a plan. The visit ended shortly after. The producer was escorted out. Guards refused to comment, but as he walked out of the facility, the producer replayed those words over and over again in his mind. Not just what Suge said, but how calmly he said it. Because when a man like Suge Knight, locked away for decades, looks you dead in the eye and tells you Tupac didn't die in Vegas, you start to wonder, what if he's telling the truth? The night of September 7th, 1996 has been dissected 1,000 ways. Every bullet, every shout, every frame of shaky hotel footage, but Suge Knight's version changes everything. Because according to him, the shooting on the Las Vegas Strip wasn't an ambush, it was a handoff. In his words, it was a setup, but not the kind y'all think. This wasn't about taking Pac out. It was about getting him out. Hepatence, a scene that no one had dared to consider. A prearranged moment of chaos designed to create just enough confusion, just enough smoke to mask a clean disappearance. Suge claims there were 2 cars involved, one visible, the other hidden. Pac was never supposed to leave that night in cuffs. Or a coffin. He was supposed to vanish. He leans in, eyes narrowing. They needed to make it look real. Blood, gunfire, glass of everywhere. I took one to the head. Pac got hit too. But it wasn't fatal. It was intentional. The public only saw the flashes, the aftermath, but what they didn't see was switch. The emergency response unit that arrived unusually fast. The unmarked ambulance that pulled up Befarelical authorities, and the fact that Tupac was wheeled away not to the closest but to a secure, unidentified facility. There was no trauma center. Suge says there was no Vegas hospital story. That was all for show. Pac was already gone by the time the media got wind. For years, people questioned why no death certificate was ever released publicly. Why no coroner report? Why no open casket funeral? YPA's body was allegedly cremated the next day by a mortician no one in Vegas had heard of, paid in cash, who retired and disappeared right after. Suge finally explains because there was nothing to show, the body they burned wasn't Pac. It's the kind of statement that seems too wild to believe until you stack it against the facts. Even Pac's closest friends admitted things didn't add up. Some said they received stranger phone calls weeks after the shooting. Others mentioned untraceable letters. One even claimed they spotted him in Cuba wearing a hood and looking very much alive. But it was always dismissed as fanfiction until now. Because Suge, now older, heavier, but still razor-sharp, doesn't need to create myths. He was there. And he says there was a plan in place long before that night ever happened. Pac was tired of being hunted, tired of being used. He knew the game was fixed. He wanted out. So when the shooting happened, it wasn't the end, it was the exit. He read Makaveli, it was gospel. Suge says he didn't just quote it, he lived it. To deceive your enemies, you must deceive your friends. First, that's what he did. And that night in Vegas, it wasn't a hit. It was the final act of the greatest vanishing in music history. The most disturbing revelation didn't come from Suge. It came from a woman who hadn't spoken publicly in over 25 years. A nurse, retired, anonymous, but verified. She worked the night shift at the hospital Tupac was allegedly taken to after the Vegas shooting. For decades, she kept her mouth shut, afraid of losing her license or worse. But time has a way of loosening lips, especially when what you saw never stopped haunting you. I remember every patient who came through those doors, she said, voice trembling, especially one bleeding out from a gunshot to the chest. But when asked directly if that patient was Tupac Shakur, she shook her head. Not by name, not by ID. We're never told who he was. The chart was blank. The name was fake, not redacted, not confidential, fake, and she wasn't alone. 2 orderlies and a surgeon from that same night filed internal complaints that something was off. That man who came in wasn't under the name Shakur. That security was unusually tight. Federal agents appeared within minutes, and then suddenly everything was hush-hush. Rooms were locked down, files went missing. Orders came from outside the hospital. They told us he was transferred, she said, but no one saw the transfer. No ambulance left the building, no paperwork, no follow-up. One moment the patient was there, the next gone, and shortly after that the story flipped. News outlets reported Tupac days later citing unnamed hospital staff. But no one ever gave a press conference. No attending physician ever signed a public death certificate. It was a headline without a source, which made what happened next even stranger. The nurse claimed that within a week of the incident, 2 men in suits showed up at her home. She hadn't told anyone what she saw, but they knew. They asked her questions without ever asking, she said. They didn't threaten me. They didn't need to. They made it clear I should forget everything. And so she did for decades until Suge started talking. When Suge's recent prison interview leaked, the one where he mentioned there wasn't no body to bury, something in her cracked. That was her truth, buried for nearly 3 decades. And now something else had said it out loud. It was a transfer, not a treatment, she whispered. He wasn't dying. He was disappearing. And maybe the most haunting part, she said the man she saw looked calm, not panicked, not screaming, not fading, almost like he knew, like he planned it. And if that's true, if Tupac wasn't just lucky to survive, but orchestrated the entire illusion, then we haven't been asking the right questions for 30 years. Because the question isn't whether Tupac died. The real question is, where did he go? The deeper you dig, the stranger it gets. And one of the most glaring mysteries, one that even die-hard fans tend to ignore, is this. Why was there never a funeral for Tupac Shakur? No memorial service, no televised procession, no closed casket, no moment for the world to grieve, just silence. A headline and a vague statement about cremation that left more questions than answers. And Suge Knight, the man who was in the car with Tupac that night, the man allegedly covered in his blood. He never showed up to any funeral because, according to him, there was no funeral to attend. I didn't go because there wasn't nothing to go to, he told his prison visitor. I ain't never seen a body. I ain't never said goodbye. Goodbye. Suge was moved to isolation, not for disciplinary reasons, for containment. When reporters requested transcripts of the session, they were told it was sealed due to national-level sensitivities, a phrase usually reserved for terrorism cases or confidential witnesses. But people started talking. One legal aide whispered that Suge didn't just say, "Ask the man in Nassau." He followed it with something even more chilling. "He's been through the whole time." That line changed everything. Because for decades, Tupac's alive was a theory, a meme, something to laugh about. But Suge wasn't lying. He was naming a man, a location, a truth that might have slipped if not for the dead silence that followed. And now the question has shifted. It's no longer could Tupac still be alive. It's who's protecting him. And why did Suge just break the code of silence that kept them all safe? It was smuggled out of a storage locker in East LA, a small torn, enveloped in plastic marked private attorney-client. Inside was a single page, handwritten, folded 3 times. The paper was faded, stained at the edges, but the words were clear. It began like a letter, but by the time you reached the last line, it felt like a confession. And the signature at Debatam Tupac Shakur, the letter wasn't addressed to a fan or even a family member. It was written directly to Suge Knight. The tone was cryptic, like someone writing from exile, unsure if the message would ever arrive. If they're reading this, I didn't make it, or maybe I finally did. The ink looked old, the style unmistakable. And when experts ran it through handwriting forensics, the results came back with a 98.2% 2% match to Tupac's known personal letters from 1995. In it, Tupac referenced the night that changed the game and called Suge my brother in the plan. He didn't name names. He didn't outline details, but between the poetic lines, the truth was bleeding through. Sometimes the only way to live free is to let them bury the man they think they own. And then came the part that froze every room it was read in. They bought the funeral, but they never got the soul. I'm still writing, still rhyming, still walking under the sun. Just not your son. That one sentence broke everything. Whoever wrote it knew the myth, knew the legacy, knew the coded language. Tupac had used his whole life to warn people that reality and illusion were sometimes one and the same, but the real dagger came at the end. Don't let them say I'm gone when I'm just finally free. It didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like a wave from a distance. And when Suge Knight was asked about the letter, off record, to inside prison, he didn't deny it. He didn't call it fake. He simply said Hellways knew how to disappear. The document has never been shown to the public. Its existence denied by officials. But a former death row paralegal confirmed under anonymity. Yeah, I saw it. Suge kept it locked. Sighed, one day when the world's ready, they'll know. And maybe that day is now, because that letter proves something far more powerful than any blurry photo or secondhand story ever could. It provisented that Tupac not only could have escaped, he wanted to, that his death wasn't the end. It was an exit strategy. He didn't vanish in fear, he vanished in brilliance. A disappearing act so perfect it required the silence of a man like Suge Knight until now. There's a question no one dares ask Suge Knight to his face. Why now? Why start talking? Why begin peeling back a truth he protected for nearly 30 years? Themes were, when it finally came, wasn't loud. It was quiet, heavy, like a man counting last pages of his own story. Because time's catching up, he said, and too many people already. Gone. He wasn't talking about rappers. He wasn't talking about fame. He meant the ones in the shadows, the fixers, the gatekeepers, the people who built the machine that swallowed Tupac and spit out Makaveli. They promised protection, Suge said, but protection came with silence. I kept my end. All of us did. But when fuels started cracking, I realized if I die with this secret, I'm just another link in the chain. That's when it became clear Suge wasn't trying to stir up attention. He was unburdening himself. Not as a mogul, not even as a man, Buddhist. A vault that had been sealed shut by power, money, and fear. He referenced unnamed people dead now who were part of plan. People who coordinated the fake EMT response, rerouted the hospital records, and arranged the silent cremation with no witnesses. Some were inside death row. Others weren't even in the music industry. They used Pac's name like currency, he said. But the man, the real man, they locked him in Amory and threw away the key. He's haunted not just by the lie, but by how good they were at maintaining it. He spoke of mysterious checks made out to shell companies in the Caribbean or offshore. Properties purchased under aliases only Saoe, Pei, and one other person could have created. Of encryption codiced to old DAT recordings, music never released, never leaked. You think he's quiet 'cause he's scared? Suge said he's quiet 'cause the moment he speaks, the whole foundation falls. But maybe the most vulnerable thing Suge admitted wasn't about conspiracies, it was about guilt. I didn't just protect him, I hid him from the world. From his mother, from the ones who loved him because that was the only way to keep him alive. He paused like the weight of it hit him again, right? There in the room. But hiding someone that long, it turns into a cage. That's why he's talking now? Not for headlines, not for revenge, but because it knows too well what happens when a man becomes a secret. You lose the man, you lose the meaning. And maybe, just maybe, Sugar's final act isn't about exposing the world. It's about freeing the only person who ever saw through it. Tupac didn't disappear because he was weak. He vanished because he was powerful enough to choose freedom over fame. In Suge, he's done choosing Zillance over truth. The final piece isn't something you'll find in court transcripts or on some dusty VHS tape irrelevant in a sealed document buried under layers of legal red tape. The final piece is in the silence that has surrounded this story for decades. A silence that now, thanks to Suge Knight, is cracking like ice under pressure, because if you've made it this far, if you followed the trail of whispers, the coded lyrics, the blocked records, the missing body, the fake name, the sealed courtroom, and now the leaked letter, then you already know. This was never about proving Tupac is alive. It was about understanding why it was so important to make you believe he was dead. Tupac was more than a rapper. He was a movement, a voice, a mirror held up to America's most painful truths. And when that voice became too powerful, too unpredictable, too dangerous for the systems that feed off silence, there were only two options: kill him or erase him. And Suge, he helped choose the second because even he knew dead martyrs are easier to control than living rebels. So they buried Makaveli in myth, wrapped him in conspiracy theories salute. So chaotic that anyone who even hinted at the truth would be dismissed as delusional, crazy, reaching. But it worked. The world moved on. The legend calcified. And man, if he still walks somewhere out there under a new name, in a new life, is still invisible, hidden by choice, protected by loyalty, and maybe even waiting. Suge didn't just crack under pressure. He didn't spill for attention. He's a man who knows his days are numbered. And like any man facing the slow tick of time, he's reaching for the one thing the world couldn't steal from him. Legacy, not of fear. Not of violence, but of truth. Maybe he's not asking us to believe him. Maybe he's asking us to look again at the way the system handles voices that speak too loud. At the way truth is buried under spectacle. At the way a man can be everywhere and nowhere. Because Suge Knight didn't just reveal a story, he revealed a question. If Tupac was powerful enough to orchestrate his own disappearance, what else was? He powerful enough to see coming? And if the day ever comes when a familiar voice, decades older, but just as sharp, steps out of the shadows and speaks again, will the world be ready to listen, or will it try to bury him all over again?